Around 2,000 years ago during Han Dynasty, you had records of exploding bamboo. However, this was mostly used for entertainment and for religious purposes. Just like when I was a kid, throwing bamboo plugged in, you throw it in the fire, it could make a sound, a pop sound. It was fun for kids. Now another thing is it could ward off spirits, so I can see it being used for religious purposes. In fact, they're still used symbolically today for that purpose. That being said, there was no mention of gunpowder chemicals, so it could just be simply bamboo with something to plug the hole. We don't know for sure. Now during the Tang Dynasty about 800 AD, you had mentions of an alchemist accidentally burning his house down. It is the first record of gunpowder in China. Now, contrary to some belief, China did use gunpowder as weapons. They didn't invent this stuff, but the earliest stuff that they made was simply a bamboo tube, and you put gunpowder in it, and all kinds of things can happen. One of the earliest ways of actually using gunpowder is with fire lances. In 10th century China, we have artwork depiction of someone holding a tube-like device, maybe made of clay pottery or colored bamboo, we're not sure, but the color is not naturally bamboo. But as you can see from the paintings of Deng Huang, this is clearly a fire lance, or even a hand cannon, but I think it's more of a fire lance because it's shooting flames, and gunpowder during this time is still pretty slow burning, so it doesn't violently shoot flames. Rather, it's a more slower flamethrower-like device, and it would be likely used like a flamethrower. Now, during the same time, they would put things inside the bamboo to make it a more noxious gas, or they also tried exploring with arrows putting inside. We also, during this time, we had writings of fire arrows, specifically gunpowder variants, which was a much better incendiary, which allowed more effective use of fire arrows using gunpowder. So at what point does it become a hand cannon? Now from the 10th to the 12th century, there's very few sources, and it's difficult for us today to be certain when the first hand cannon, the first gun, was invented that was designed specifically to shoot bullets. But we know it's around this time from 10th century to 12th century. But these were pretty primitive guns. They shoot pretty much once and then the gun is useless. It's just your one-shot cannon. So then, by the 13th century, now you finally get into archaeological evidence. And what I have here is more of a toy, but the earliest one depicted is the Heilongjiang hand cannon, which comes from northeastern China around the 13th century. And that's really the first archaeological find of a hand cannon. I actually have a reproduction being made, and I can't wait to actually test it out. Now, by the 13th century, when the Mongols conquered the Chinese, the Mongols were able to spread this technology all over the world. For example, the Middle East and in India. And I think the Middle Eastern firearms and the Indian guns definitely deserve their own separate videos, because it takes, there's so much interesting stuff about those. But I want to go very quickly to the European side of things, because that's when guns really took off into what we know today. So now let's get into the European stuff after the Mongols.
Hello, my name is James Taylor. I'm an avid collector of antiques and old stuff, and today we're going to talk about the history of chucking stuff from a European perspective once gunpowder reached continental Europe. So this is what has become called the original hand-gun. So this instrument was called a handgun, and it's spelled G-O-N-N-E, and that is where the modern term handgun comes from. I also find it quite interesting that the early people that used these, they were hand-goners, and if you've heard the expression, he's a goner, she's a goner, it meant that they were a hand-goner and their device blew up and probably fatally injured them. So basically, early metallurgy wasn't that great, so there was chances that the device could explode on the user. Typically, at first, they would put gunpowder, rocks, arrows. Later on, they would use pieces of lead, and then eventually into round balls. Typically, once your powder was down in your projectile, then you put a little bit of powder in what we call a touch hole. And either they would use a red hot iron that was in a fire to light it, or they could have a burning wick and use that to ignite the powder charge and then detonating the handgun. So these became to replace eventually the crossbows and the bows, and the advantage of it was you didn't need to train anybody. You could take the baker, you could take the stable boy, you can give them one of these, and all they have to do is stand there and hold it and wait for it to go bang. Later on, somebody got the bright idea, well, it's kind of hard holding that wick there all the time, so they came up with a very rudimentary trigger system. So you have kind of an S-shaped, a serpentine piece of metal, and what you would do then is you would put your burning match in there, and then when you're ready to fire, you can just lower it into the touch hole and it would go bang. Over the next couple hundred years, they kind of took that idea and the weapon eventually evolved. And we have what we call the early arquebuses. Same kind of idea. You would have a lever that would deliver a burning match, like so, into the pan. So kind of using the same kind of trigger system you would find on early crossbows. I call this the tickler. You would squeeze the tickler and it would lower the match into your pan where you had your powder, and it would set off the powder, and which would ignite the secondary charge, which would be down the barrel. So the early arquebuses tended to be quite short and very, very heavy, and again, this was more a sign of the metallurgy of the time. They didn't have the skills and the technique to make something very robust to withstand the pressures and the gases. But eventually, as the technology got better and the craftsmen developed, they got into longer barrels, lighter barrels, and again, same kind of mechanism. And then over time, they would come and use a trigger system like you would recognize on a modern firearm. So these, a gun like this would have been used in the British Civil War. Would it seen its way to North America with the early European explorers, and was used throughout kind of continental Europe. Eventually, they went on to invent a more robust ignition system, and then instead of using a burning match, using flint and steel. So you have a piece of flint which is striking a piece of steel, creating sparks, and the sparks now fall into the pan and igniting your primary charge, which would then set off your secondary charge. And the flintlock system would be kind of the status quo for the next couple hundred years, and then eventually it would be slowly replaced by the percussion cap system. And so there you have your early firearms and how they worked.
Well, thanks a lot for watching. Stay tuned.